Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar on developmental evaluation. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands I'm joining you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my deepest respects to the elders past and present. My name's Cam. I look after the Academy here at Clear Horizon, and Clear Horizon is one of Asia Pacific's largest evaluation and design consultancies. We're a Melbourne-based company. We're all about supporting change makers with co-design and evaluation solutions for people, place, and planet. And our Academy is about taking that knowledge that's been hard won by our consultants over about 20 years of practice and translating it into really applicable, practical courses. We deliver courses on measurement, evaluation, and learning, most significant change, data visualization and reporting, as well as the topic of our current webinar, developmental evaluation. And we're really excited to be both sharing a webinar on the topic, but also releasing a course at the end of this month about developmental evaluation, which we'll talk about at the end. For those of you who may not have attended one of our webinars before, we'll start with a selection of questions that we received from you via your registrations, and that's going to help us get the conversation flowing. And then we'll open up to live questions from the audience. So there's about 15 minutes at the end for that. If you want to ask a question of the panelists, type your questions into the Q&A box, which you'll see down at the bottom, labeled Q&A. And if you see a question in there that you like the look of, you can upvote it. And that way we'll make sure we answer the most top voted questions at the end. If you have any comments you want to make to us as we go through, or to other participants, you can use the chat function just like you do in any normal Zoom session. Yeah, really want to encourage you both to get in there into the Q&A and the chat function, and yeah, make this a live session. It's open to you to get in there and comment. I want to make sure you know that at the end of the session, the recording will be shared via everyone who's registered, and please feel free to share that around the place. If you know anyone that might appreciate listening to a recording of it, please do share it. Okay, so it's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. Joining me today, we have Kate McKeag, Jamie Gamble, and Jess Dart. And all of our panelists have been working hard with us to create the course on developmental evaluation. So we're all very, very excited to be talking about this with you today. So first up, Kate is an independent consultant and a pragmatic academic. She's also a founding member of Aotearoa New Zealand Evaluation Association, or ANZIA for short, co-founder of the Developmental Evaluation Institute, director of the Knowledge Institute, and a member of the Connect group. So Kate's pretty busy most of the time. There's a lot on her plate there. Welcome, Kate. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Cam. It's a pleasure to be here. It's just wonderful, and I'm looking forward to it.
Great. We've got a lot of people from all around the world joining us today, and one of those people is Jamie Gamble. Jamie has an extensive international evaluation experience, having worked in India, New Zealand, and Mexico, and all across Canada where he's based. And not only that, he literally wrote the book on DE, which is called a Developmental Evaluation Primer, and he wrote that back in 2008. So another innovator and groundbreaker in this space joining us today. Thanks so much, Jamie, for making time to join us.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
And last but not least, we have Jess Dart. I'm sure many of you will recognize Jess from previous courses we've run or from webinars we've run in the past. Jess Dart is our founding director of Clear Horizon. She's an AES award-winning evaluator. And for those of you who don't know what AES is, that's the Australasian Evaluation Society. And she's co-creator of this course and many of the other courses that we run at Clear Horizon Academy. Welcome back, Jess. Oh, you're on mute.
Classic beginning, hey? Lovely to see you all, and nice to see Kate and Jamie as well in this evening for Jamie, morning for me. We're a bit early because we're trying to make the time zones work today.
There's about a 1 hour window where it lines up perfectly for everyone in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. So this is it. All right, well, thanks again for joining us. Let's dive into the questions. So in the most basic terms, how do you define developmental evaluation and what makes it different from other forms of evaluation? I might open up to you first, Jess.
Yeah, at the most basic level, I would say that the thing that defines developmental evaluation is that the thing that you're developing, doesn't exist yet. So it's developmental in purpose. It's aimed at making things. So that makes it different from what we often learn about is the formative evaluation and summative evaluation. I don't know if you've learned those terms, but formative is about improving something that exists, and summative is about testing, to see whether it works or not. And it's sort of in the final stages, normally at the end of the program. So they're the things we learn about. Well, developmental evaluation is like a third thing. It's like when there is nothing, or there is very little, or you're really changing form. So it's developmental in purpose. And the other thing I'd say, I know you said, but I'll just say too, is it's not development, it's not international development. I have seen people get really confused with that. It's got nothing to do with international development. So it means development as in making something. Yeah, that's probably enough from me.
Thanks for clarifying that at the end there, Jess. That's great to know. Jamie, how about you?
Well, Jess, I think you nailed it as always. But if you think about like when is something new, we talk often in development evaluation about these niches, these like when is DE best suited? And I think that's also a really helpful way to think about how DE is different. So think about, you're taking something and you're adapting it because you're moving into a different context, or you're creating something entirely novel from scratch, like just said, it's never existed before. Or maybe you actually have something that does exist, but you are constantly making adaptations. Like there's just so much change going on in your environment. You're always responding to those. So it's pretty significant and substantial changes. Or maybe there's a global pandemic and you need to respond to a crisis. Like all of a sudden, what you do and how you do it fundamentally changes. And then lastly, I think there's a niche we often see people taking a success and then applying it to a different part of the system. So maybe a program has shown to be really successful, but what does it mean to take that and apply it to policy change or to a larger sort of culture change? And development evaluation can be a great support to that kind of shift as well.
That's great, Jamie. So it sounds like developmental evaluation is more and more important as the world gets more and more unpredictable. Or maybe the world has always been unpredictable, but yeah. Sorry, Jess.
And now it's got to solve climate change now. That's my latest thing. I'm watching the news this week.
Yeah, the IPCC report's not looking good. And Kate, what are your thoughts?
Oh, well, look, Jess and Jamie have pretty much nailed it, but I guess the only thing I would add, and it was nice when you said, Cam, that the world has got more and more unpredictable. And I guess that for me, what makes DE, at its most basic level is that it's a practice for the complexity that we are living in. So it's an evaluative practice for that complexity. And we kind of grew up with assumptions about context that were really kind of simple and straightforward, whereas so much around us is complex and unknown. So when we've got really high levels of agreement, when we don't have high levels of agreement about what the issues are or how we might address it, we're still kind of learning our way forward. We need an evaluative practice that can work alongside initiatives as they develop. Just as Jess said, we're starting from scratch, or we don't really know what the right path is. So as things emerge, we need a practice, an evaluative practice that helps us to adapt and respond to those changing needs, as at the same time as supporting that critical thinking, inquiry, and rapid learning using evidence. So yeah, that's what I would say that would hit its most basic level.
Thanks, Kate. That's great. So now that we're a little bit clearer on what DE definitely is, be interesting to hear what DE is not. I might start with you, Jamie.
I think I would start by saying what it's not is abandoning evaluation, right? Like if we are developing something, but what we're doing is bringing the best of evaluation into that. So critical thinking, use of evidence, use of data. More and more I'm hearing people say, oh, I have a reflective practice, therefore I'm doing DE. And I don't think that's the case, right? I think you may want to use reflective practice as part of a larger developmental evaluation process. But if you're not drawing upon data, not drawing upon evidence, not using that critical evaluative thinking that is essential to evaluation, then it's not DE.
That's great. Kate.
Yeah, it's a great question, Cam, and thanks, Jamie, for that, because I think it's really important to distinguish between, you know, I noticed there's a question in the chat there about is it just like a design process? Like lots of these processes we can use in DE, but I guess DE is also not just about tracking and monitoring things and describing what's going on. Nor is it about developing grand designs, evaluation designs and plans for 2 or 3 years. Although we're likely to use monitoring data, we've got to use data in DE to inform our kind of questioning and inquiry and that kind of stuff as something is unfolding. But it's more likely to be in small cycles of design and implementation of what we're doing, and always open to adapting when things change. Yeah, so it's not like the evaluation we're used to doing.
Definitely. Anything you want to add there, Jess?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Kate and Jamie, and just to say that I guess it's also, Michael Patton says it's not evaluation light, and I think that is something people fall into, that it's reflective practice and we get together and press the pause button and talk about how things are going. That can be a part of developmental evaluation, but as Jamie says, we actually apply everything in my toolkit exhausts me. Developmental evaluation exhausts me because I have to, go from qualitative data to quantitative data, systems thinking. I have to use everything I've ever learned in evaluation, and I have to apply it on my feet. I don't even get to really think that far in advance about what is needed. It's not evaluation light, it's just that it's sort of evaluation agile almost, but we do use like really full-on methodologies. And I guess somebody else asked, how does it differ from design? Well, I think we often work alongside designers. So that's me, I'm working often with a design group, and they know very much what I'm doing versus what they're doing, because because we're bringing the evaluation tool to the table, and we have this rigor around testing things that the designers love. They love the fact that we have spent our lives focusing on how you test things in a rigorous way, and the evaluation methodologies we bring.
It really does sound like it's an advanced kind of form of evaluation. It's not, as you're saying, not evaluation light. So it's something you need to come with everything you've learnt in the past as an evaluator, which I guess is why we say in the course that we run that it's not a beginner level course. You need to have some grounding in MEL, on measurement, evaluation and learning, before you come to it. I'd love to know why this form of evaluation is important and why you even think it's needed.
Is it me, Cam? Do you want me to lead off here?
Yeah, you haven't led yet, so take it away.
Take it away. I guess one of the things that struck me in doing DE over a number of years and why it's so important, is that I think it gives our communities self-determination to be able to do their own thing. I think DE is really attuned to the rhythm of the work that's going on the ground in our communities. And it can be, and it's in the kind of way in which it works. It doesn't have to be squashed into somebody else's time frame or somebody else's design frame or somebody else's cycle, that it can be very attuned to the rhythm of what's going on in a community or in an initiative that's happening on the ground. And I think it's really important that we can have a practice that's so attuned to this immediate learning and inquiry that's going on inside real people's lives on the ground, and that they can be self-determining about that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kate. Jamie.
Well, I agree with everything Kate just said. I would add, I think we've reached a saturation point for traditional problem solving. I think if you step back, we've actually made really good progress on technical problems, like things where there's a knowable, maybe even like an obvious solution. we've done really well, but we're facing these massive diminishing returns on deploying those traditional approaches to the problem areas that remain. And these are significant, like poverty, climate, and equity. And so we need tools, approaches, resources that are oriented to the kind of innovation, scale, and adaptation needed to find our way through these massive challenges we face as a planet. And I just think DE is just optimally suited to do that.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I mean, it's the time for social innovation. And what does social innovation mean? Social innovation means trying to learn your way through change, try things you've never tried, work together with communities in new ways, because things are getting harder to address. And so how does evaluation fit with that? I think evaluation or developmental evaluation can power that. It can actually make it better, make it scale quicker, make it work better, accelerate it, build, give it credibility, de-risk it even. I've seen some governments who only want to go down the social innovation route if evaluation is next to it, because what they say, de-risks the design process. If you're looking at how well the engagement's going, if you're looking at how people are responding, if you're looking at how safe it is, if you're evaluating it from all angles at the same time, then it's a sort of safer ride. And it is a bumpy ride when you're going into the unknown. So I think the reason why we love developmental evaluation is because it partners so well with social innovation, and social innovation is needed so much at the moment. And it's got this promise of addressing gnarly, wicked problems that we seem to have a lot of right now, especially this week with and the pandemic. It's been a really appropriate methodology for all the changes that people have had to make through the pandemic, hasn't it? It's really had its day. It's having its day at the moment, developmental evaluation. It's like a methodology of its time. And for us evaluators who've spent our lives working in evaluation, it's like, it feels like where you should be, or where you should be. Well, I feel like this way anyway. This is how to make my craft relevant to what's going on around.
Do either of you have, or any of you have an example of how it's been used to the pandemic maybe, or climate change, or one of these big issues we're facing? I'm putting you on the spot here, but.
Well, I mean, I think people are using it to decide what pivots to make without even calling it developmental evaluation. Like, for example, in our own company, in Clear Horizon, the number of changes that we had to make, and we had sort of applied the approach to developmental evaluation to decide how to make decisions. And we met really regularly, and we started doing things in shorter cycles. That's an example. I'm sure that it's been used more than people even probably thought it would be. I don't know if that's a good example. I'm sure Jamie and Kate probably got better examples.
Yeah, I guess I want to shout out to some colleagues of mine in New Zealand who've been working with our Ministry of Health, and they were working last year looking at a vaccination program, as it turns out, not for COVID, but for Māori, and they used a DE, short cycles, rapid evaluation cycles. They didn't call it DE, that's not what it was called, but it was evaluation, it was developmental, it was rapid, where they were able to bring data to the table and wrestle with it with senior decision makers right up to the top of the ministry, to be able to make decisions about preparing the ground for the vaccination rollout program that we've now got. So yeah, so I think it's definitely helping in all sorts of places.
I think people are calling it real-time evaluation here in Australia. So there's been quite a lot of work, like, for example, when the child and maternal services had to go online quickly. So, in 2 weeks, they had to pivot to providing the services online. So they did a rapid evaluation of a pilot and then brought the data to it and then immediately adapted the service. But they didn't call it, like you said, Kate, they didn't call it developmental evaluation. They called it real-time or rapid evaluation. That's what they've been calling it, yeah, DHHS. Really interesting work they've been doing, but I would call that developmental as well.
Yeah, I've seen a really on small and large scales in the last year. So kind of in that move to the online environment. I mean, it's the obvious example, but like an arts education center I work with, the whole mental health initiative, like all of a sudden everybody we've just got to do tomorrow. We've got to serve people, and the fundamental way that we've served people in the past no longer applies. So let's do stuff, but let's be really purposeful in like, well, what are we trying out? Like, what are we actually testing here? And how can we actually meaningfully gather some data? So yeah, we're processing it, we're observing it, but can we actually gather some data that will give us insight into the next iteration? And both of the examples had, fortunately, like lots of cycles, like things were tried out and the next month something else could happen, something else could happen. And so I think that kind of small scale adjustment to bringing stuff online is everywhere. But at the same time, working with like large national institutions that are grappling with the other pandemic, which is like racial inequity, right? And trying to fundamentally change their systems, their structures, and their processes. And they're embedding DE kind of internally to say, okay, how well are we doing in this shift? And what are we learning as we go along? And how do we actually get to this place that we want to get to? And it's a much longer journey, but it's an extremely powerful one, and DE equally suited to that kind of shift that's underway.
Great, thank you. Well, there's some really juicy examples in there. It strikes me that just the image for me of the virus learning and replicating and mutating and changing and adapting, and we need, in order to keep up with it and get ahead of it, we need to be doing the same, right? So yeah, interesting. So what should we be watching out for when we're looking to apply DE? For example, what would you say to someone who's just about to start a role in DE? What would you tell them? Jamie, yeah.
Okay, I would say check that it's really a developmental situation, right? Like, is something on the table that there's some serious innovation going on, there's some serious complexity around it. DE tends to be a little more resource intensive, so put those resources to the places where I think it is best suited. So check that, and then are you ready? Like, are you ready to learn? And do you have the authority, the will, the capacity to adapt? Because you may learn a ton, but if you're in a rigid system and you can't actually apply what's being learned, you can really sort of shortchange the development. And again, that's just not a good use of resources. So I would really kind of check that readiness before you proceed.
Kate?
Oh, so important, Jamie, that readiness, gosh. And you can think you've got it, and then you realize down the track that it's not really there. So it's a continual process of checking in, isn't it? I guess one of the things that I'd say to someone who is starting out is to remember that it's called evaluation for a reason. It's got that thing values in the middle of it. So it's not evidence light. So it's not DE isn't evidence light, but it's also has to be values rich. And I guess it's about making sure that along the way that it's important to get to the heart of what really matters to people, what's going on, and the assumptions that we make. We need a critical practice in developmental evaluation to discover, explore, and unpack our assumptions and the values that we hold and others hold, because they make a difference to the choices that we make. They impact the decisions that we make about how we proceed, and those affect someone. So, I'd be asking those starting out, and I'd be saying, for all of those who've got a stake in this particular initiative, what's going on that's valuable here? What counts as valuable? And to those who have a stake in it, what would you see, hear, feel, and what would the facts be if you saw value in this particular context and initiative? And be asking those questions on an ongoing basis. Yeah.
Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, we often use principles, don't we, Kate, to that end. I find it increasingly, I find myself sort of clarifying and agreeing some principles of the initiative, and then really using those to drive the work all the way through. Increasingly, I can't find any other way of doing it, because everything else sort of changes so much. The theory of change changes, everything changes, but if you get a good set of principles, they can anchor you all the way through. it's the values. But I would say as well, one thing I've learned, and I've learned the hard way, that's why I tell people this, is that don't rush into evaluation planning. It sounds so obvious. We would, everything before developmental evaluation, I used to always, my first step was to develop a big evaluation plan, a rigorous plan, and then you sort of implement it. That doesn't work. It's so annoying, but it doesn't work. So the first thing is, don't develop a big plan. Don't spend all your time developing a big plan. It's sort of like try and be useful and stand behind the social innovation process and let the evaluation plan unfold maybe a little bit later than you normally would, and keep it fairly light, because it's likely to change quite a lot, because it has to change as the thing you're developing starts to be developed, because you don't exactly know what you're going to need to do. It's quite a different orientation, and that can really trip you up. The first time I did a developmental evaluation, I built this big plan like I always did, that's what I thought I was supposed to do, and then the organization completely pivoted, the project completely pivoted towards this collective networked approach, and I had to redo the plan. I thought, okay, well, fine, I'll just redo it. But guess what? It pivoted again and again and again, and then I was like, I'm spending all the budget on evaluation planning, and I'm not being useful. So I'm going to have to stop doing this, because this is just no good. I'm not good for anybody. So I would say, take a slow cooked approach to evaluation planning. Don't use all your money up and all your time up developing an evaluation plan. That's really not where the action's at. It's better to be useful to begin with.
Great advice there, Jess. Saving cost and time. I've got a really important question here from Brett that I want to jump to now. So he says, you're speaking in a bit of an abstract way about the philosophical background and context, which is helpful, but can you be a bit more concrete and explain what it looks like? So what does it actually look like? What does DE look like when you're doing it well? What are you doing? What are you thinking?
Well, I mean, one thing, what we're just about to do this course on developmental evaluation. We've been thinking about this question: how do you demystify it? And one of the things we've done is we've really tried to talk about 3 phases of DE, and there's the starting phase, and that takes a long time to get organised and get started, and build the culture really check the readiness and get all the contracting sorted out, and maybe develop some principles and get started. And there's a middle phase where it looks a bit more like traditional evaluation, where you're actually testing and trying things. And there's a sort of release phase where you sort of let go of that phase and get ready for the next. So it depends where you are in the cycle to what it looks like. But maybe that's a framework to start thinking about it, which we work through in the course. I don't know about Jamie. What do you think? What are the practical?
Yeah, it's a classic challenge like that. I think people, because there is a lot of jargon. It's a lot of big ideas, and you do need to nail down. You do need to understand complexity to navigate your way through. But at the end of the day, you are answering evaluative questions. So like you're saying, like in that first phase, like what are the questions? Like there's someone who's designing something, or a group of people designing something. And to one of the questions, it could be small scale, but it also could be large scale. But what is it that they need to know to make choices about strategy? And they probably have a lot of uncertainty about those choices. Developmental evaluation says, great, let's go get some data, perspective, evidence as quickly as possible to inform that next fork in the road, that strategy choice that's coming up that says, oh, we should be doing this to advance towards this bigger goal that we have, or we started to go down this path, but here's some really early feedback that says a lot of our assumptions are way off the mark. So we need to come back to the drawing board and rethink something and go down a different path. So you're still, the questions are going to be very specific to whatever situation you're working on. But the idea is you're trying to, as rapidly as possible, get to some kind of better understanding about them so that you go forward in a learned way, in a way that's sort of guided by what's happening.
Yeah, I would say, what does it actually look like? It's a great question, because I asked the same question, didn't I, about values? What do they feel like? What does it look like and feel like when you're actually on the ground doing this DE? I guess what it feels and looks like to me is that you are you develop a close relationship, a good relationship in the first instance with the people that you're working with, so that they trust you to go out and collect data, trust you to gather perspectives, different perspectives, and they are also open to the idea that you might bring stuff back that might be not what they want to hear necessarily. It might be stuff that they hadn't realized was out there, surprises, and that together you're going to support them to wrestle with that data and make sense of it for the next fork in the road that Jamie's talking about. So I guess they need to trust that you have that, you know, it's that trusted relationship is what it feels like on the ground. What you see developmental evaluators doing is collecting data, putting stuff together. You see them working alongside you, facilitating sense-making processes. You see them doing some reporting. You see them, although we do less and less big reporting, we often do smaller kinds of reports. Yeah, so I think that's what you'll see. It's no less rigorous than other forms of evaluation. In fact, I think where the real rigor in this kind of evaluation is in the evaluative reasoning that we do together with our clients. So we're putting data on the table and doing that reasoning and that thinking together, that making sense of stuff, because there often isn't one answer. You've got to kind of manage tensions in the data when you're doing this kind of really complex work. You've got to kind of, on the one hand, there might be this in the data, but on the other hand, there might be this other thing showing up. So you'll see a developmental evaluator supporting that thinking and that reasoning about, well, how do we manage our way through these tensions? So yeah, that's what I'd say. I don't know if that makes it any clearer for you. It is hard.
And it's a different stance, isn't it, Kate? It's like, in traditional evaluation, it's almost like you've got the floor. You're like, oh, out of the way, the evaluators are here, you know, don't change the design because we need to fix it in so that we can properly test it. Well, you don't have that floor. You're standing behind the people who are trying to make change. That's why it's a bit harder to talk about, because you're not leading, essentially. They're leading. The change makers are leading. They're trying to work out how to fix something. And you're going, how can I help? How can I help? What can I test? You know, what can I do now? How can I challenge? Oh, can I challenge that assumption? You know, you're helping them. So it's like standing behind. It's different positioning for an evaluator. You don't have as much control.
Great, thank you so much for clarifying that. I think that really gets to the heart of Brett's question. And I'm sure as we move through, there'll be more examples of what this thing looks like. So interested to hear what it's been like for you three working together in pulling together this course. Whoever wants to start, yeah.
Also, it's been fabulous. We'd have these planning calls with like 10 items, and we'd be on item 2 at the end of 2 hours because we just have these great conversations. And so I think we've kind of pushed the practice and maybe clarified the practice and codified the practice, which I'm really excited about. And for me, I think just what I've learned in terms of this approach to learning that is really amazing, right? That Clear Horizon has really kind of nailed it, I think, in terms of the online learning environment, the self-paced way. And so I've been really appreciative of what I've learned in terms of your expertise around how to put something like this on. So I'm excited to see it live very soon.
Yeah, we've never brought outsiders in to build the course, so it's been so fantastic to have Jamie and Kate on. We had all these early morning calls, didn't we, for quite a while. We were fighting over some of it, you know, what do you think that? I know, what would that be? Because we were really trying to demystify it and lay it out as one of the learners says, what does it really look like? How do you really do it? So we've been really trying to make it really, really practical. That's what my aim has been. And I think I wasn't sure we were going to get there, and suddenly it unfolded, didn't it? Really clearly. So I'm excited to see. I think it's the best course we've ever put together, actually. And I think it's because we've had Jamie and Kate with us. Yeah.
Oh, look, I've loved being part of this as well. I guess it's been I found it a really good learning curve, steep learning curve for myself in terms of thinking about the learning side as well. You know, like, although I've presented at conferences and run workshops and all of that kind of stuff, often you rely on that face-to-face kind of interaction to be able to kind of go with the flow a bit. This is much more disciplined in terms of getting us to think about what are the core parts of this practice that we want to share, and how can we present it in a way that people can learn in this environment in a way that's really practical and useful. I mean, Jess, you know, making things practical, it's been a real test of my, you know, as you say, Jamie, that kind of codifying some of the stuff that we do, which has been not so codified actually. Even in our workshops, we have still kind of dealt with, you know, the question that said, oh, you're kind of talking at this philosophical level. In workshops and things, you're often still quite at that level, whereas this course, you're going to have some really practical, I'm hoping really useful things that are going to emerge for you about how to do this and how to apply it in your practice. That's been the most exciting thing for me, and it's been a wild ride. And I imagine for the learning designers alongside us, it's still a bit wild as we're getting to the finish line. And so I just want to shout out to all the learning designers, because they've been amazing and they're really pushing my own learning about.
I didn't even know what a learning designer was a few years ago. It's this fantastic new discipline, isn't it? This new, it's like a new profession, a learning designer. It's amazing. Yeah.
It's a bit like evaluation. It's been around for 20 or 30 years, but it's having its day in the sun at the moment.
Oh, so. I hadn't bumped across it, even though I've been running training, obviously ignorantly running training without knowing that stuff for years.
You've been doing it without knowing what you were doing or knowing it's a thing. Yeah.
Well, it's another level.
Yep. It sounds like it's really been, it's clarified for you. It's clarified your thinking, and they say that having to teach something really does that. So yeah, it's great. So now we're up to the point of answering questions from the audience. So we've got one from Sonia here. As a funder commissioner, how should I estimate the cost for a DE approach?
Ooh, good question, isn't it? So we've probably all got different answers. Maybe I'll shoot off. I don't know, how do you estimate the cost? I know that we used to always say that there's somewhere between 10% and 20% can be evaluation spend of a budget. And I guess DE is going to be towards the higher end, and maybe, you know, maybe more than 10%, I would say, of the budget would be around about a healthy budget. What do you reckon, guys? I know people don't like saying this, but
it's a great question, Sonia, and it's so hard to estimate. I've been having some very interesting conversations with funders about DE in particular, as new initiatives in government are kicking off, about instead of having it in the evaluation budget line, building into the project. So building it in as R&D, building it in as capability development, because not only is it's not as independent as and separate as other evaluation, and if you're doing it right, then it's actually building capability in the team doing the work. And so that's a key part of what we're doing. So we've been having conversations about building it into the actual initiative funding line as opposed to the evaluation funding line. And like Jess says, I think, you know, because it's going to involve your team as well. It's not just the developmental evaluator who's going to be part of that. It's going to involve the team doing the work. That it's a learning and development function, and it's an R&D function. And so if it can be built in and seen as that, it, you know, 10, 15%, 20% might be realistic. It's going to depend.
The thing I'd add is, if you can avoid an RFP process, avoid it, right? Just because I've seen development evaluations that had to be sort of pre-scoped at the application. And by the time the thing really got cooking, there were so many activities that were being done just because they were in a proposal that actually added very, very little value to the initiative. And so, like, shorter contracting cycles, reassess, rescope, have built-in flexibility. Like, I fully appreciate you've got to kind of have a sense of what this is going to cost. And, you know, and I think, Jess, that's the best guidance as a starting point. But if you can have flexibility built in and have sort of stage gates along the way where you kind of relook at it, adjust, maybe it grows for a period, maybe it shrinks for a period, I think you'll be better off in the long run.
Or have some sort of, like, see it as a service, so it's more like an hourly cost rather than a set of milestones. Like increasingly we're trying to set down drawdown bucket. I sort of, when I write proposals these days, I talk about components or buckets, like this bucket of spending that you can draw down on. If you've got transparent and share where you're up to and renegotiate it, you have to renegotiate. That's the thing, isn't it, Jamie? You have to renegotiate developmental evaluation because it moves around quite a lot, because it has to follow the design, and the designs move, you know.
Yeah.
So you need flexibility in contracting, which is really challenging for government. But we're getting there. There is lots of successful developmental evaluations that have now been tendered and executed. So we know it's possible, even in government settings.
We had a couple of questions come through about that, Jess, actually. Would you be able to give an example of how you've navigated that complexity of the contractual arrangements, or what have you had success with?
Yeah, well, I guess there's several strategies, aren't there, at play. One is, like Jamie said, is just have shorter contracts. So have a scoping contract end, have the next contract end, and then so you don't get into big trouble, which, you know, for some people may be the only way. The other way is to, you purchase more on capability. So you're looking for a service, really. So you describe the capabilities you want and the amount of money you want to spend, and you set it up as components. And so it's not milestone based, it's more based on input. I suppose it's input based contracting. So you pay for the time that you get. And so I've seen that done. So the aid program does input based contracting, and that's DFAT. So in a way, governments can do input based contracting. Well, we've got 3 different governments here. We've got Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. So I guess it's different everywhere. What's your success?
Yeah, I guess for us it's been especially we're a government agency, because they're not all the same. And so we're a government agency, may not have done this before. We've, like Jamie said, we've had shorter contract cycles at the outset. We've kind of done some of the early kind of relational work, scoping work, and then come back together and revisited. So really short cycles at the outset. But then once we've got relationships established and people feeling more comfortable with what's going on, and they get it, because it is quite hard to know what it is until you're in it. And I guess that's one of the things I'd say, is that so that then once the team get what we're doing, then we've moved into what the government here is calling high trust funding, high trust contracting. So it's really just that we invoice at the end of the month with an activity, you know, here's what we've been doing, a small progress report of some kind. So not keeping it, you know, big reporting, but just, you know, here's the activity we've done, these are the number of hours, and these are the questions that are emerging at this end of the month. So yeah, and that has just continued for lots of months. And then we just revisit what the budget's doing at different times. Yeah.
Sounds like more how software developers charge for their time. Yeah.
And I have to say, people, when it's going well, people absolutely love it. They get so much value out of it. You know, my really big success story at the moment is I've been working on a long-term DE, which is 10 years. It's contracted for 10 years. Can you believe it? So the contract is 10 years long, and so that's the level of trust in that one. And now we're all working together as a team, and it's ongoing. And yeah, they just the team, the innovators, just love the developmental evaluation component. They talk about how much they enjoy it, how valuable it is all the time. So I think we're also beginning to learn about the value of this, to be held, to have this capacity building role, as Kate says, to have this critical friend on the team who writes reports. No matter how busy you are, we produce these little reports. You know, they've been so busy, that's the only thing that got written to begin with, you know. It's like they're so grateful that somebody was there to do that. So it is a powerful role that's worth paying for. I think that's what people, when it's done well, it can be. If the readiness is not there, though, it can also be a disaster, hey? So, take care in the early stages that you're ready for it.
The only thing I'd agree with all that, the sort of the retainer model, you know, with maybe like a sort of a minimum amount per month, but the potential to expand in periods of intensity, but more and more kind of a internal external hybrid. So like, as an external consultant, you're really supporting, but there's somebody internal, particularly in large organizations like government or even larger NGOs, who kind of owns the DE on the inside and wears that hat. It's economical, but it's also, I think it really helps sort of land what's learning. And I think that's become an important part of the contracting for this sort of thing. But also like circling back to the value question, like where is value being generated towards this thing that we're working on? And certainly, we need to have accountabilities towards that. And that doesn't disappear. We're just contracting differently towards that.
Great. I didn't expect to be talking about that, but that was a very rich little conversation. That's great. I'm sure very helpful for those who are both in government and also contracting to government. A question here from Amy, which we've sort of touched on, but I just want to make sure we've covered it off. She says, it seems like DE is suited to small scale innovations where there's a clear small group of decision makers. How can DE be embedded in larger scale innovations? For example, whole of government reform on a social policy issue where there's more dispersed decision making.
It can totally be there, but I think the readiness check just becomes that much more important. Like, is there permission at a senior decision-making level? If it's dispersed decision-making, is there engagement across that disbursement? Because if that's not the case, doing anything kind of innovative will be extremely difficult and will probably default to established patterns. But if you have those right conditions, I think you could really do well to have DE apply. And this is actually where we need to be going, right? This is the kind of scale that we need to be working towards. And so DE is absolutely suited to support that sort of thing when the conditions are right.
And I have to say, there are examples of that. And I guess where you need to have a unit or a group that are already working in a very innovative way, and then they can really benefit from a developmental evaluator, like a coach almost, to check in with them, where are you at? Or like Jamie says, have a developmental evaluator who's employed in the unit and sort of almost a coach to keep them steady and help them navigate. So it can feel a little bit like coaching at times in a bigger initiative. But you need that bigger group of people doing a major piece of innovation, and you need all the readiness ready for that as well. So it's not on its own. Like DE, you can't put DE in and it will solve everything. It's like a partner to a bigger reform process that is already happening. That's what I see.
Yeah, and I guess what I see is it builds on something Jamie said about the internal-external hybrid. Is in these really major reforms that are going on, you really need to think about it like a collective impact model where you have a learning centre, a learning hub that's actually built into the initiative, and the DE is a partner in that learning, and you need capacity and capability in each of the spokes out there in the dispersed part of the system where some of this change is going on, and we need to be able to move between the different parts of that networked model. So it challenges the bureaucracy of top down, because it's a much more networked and dispersed model, but the readiness, as Jamie said, for that kind of learning is really key. And you typically are likely to find that it's going to be in some parts of the system and not in others. So you might find parts of the spokes are really keen on it and there's great learning going on, and it coming back to this in being supported by a central hub or in that collective kind of impact model where you've got your backbone, where there's resources and support for the kind of learning and evidence gathering and those kinds of things for those spokes. It's likely to be good two-way and sharing across, but that doesn't always happen either. So it's never going to be perfect. It's going to be a bit lumpy and a bit of a rocky ride, but it can happen at scale, and it needs to. And certainly I'm involved in a couple that are at scale, and we're experiencing the ups and downs of both the central and the dispersed models.
I think if you've got readiness, you can apply DE to anything, really, because it's flexible and it's agile. So it's a bit different in that regard. But it's more flexible than other forms of evaluation, really, because of that. But it's probably whether you should do it and whether you can do it is probably more linked to whether there's readiness generally than whether you can put it at large scale, at low scale. I think it works really well at large scale. I'm like Kate, I'm involved in some really large scale, the developmental evaluations, long-term large scale. And the one in the 10-year one that I just mentioned, that is across, there's a network of communities involved in that, and there's quite a bit of capacity building. We're moving into a new phase where they're learning how to do it themselves. They're building their capacity to apply this learning mindset and testing things themselves. yeah, so it starts to move into more capacity building, doesn't it, Kate? If you're going to get to those spokes, as you say.
We've talked a lot about readiness today. Is there a checklist or a readiness checklist that you've created for this course by any chance?
There is. It's in the material. It's one of the tools that we'll be sharing with people through the course, and we'll spend quite a bit of time on it in one of the week 2 or 3. I can't remember what week it in. They blur together in my mind, but early on we're spending quite a bit of time on the readiness piece.
Okay, that sounded like a leading question. I genuinely didn't know. That's good to know that it's there. Okay, so how do you convince? This is a question from Kate. How do you convince, not the Kate here, but the Kate out there, how do you convince clients, funders that this is a rigorous process when you can't present a clear plan from the outset?
If you're doing convincing, then you probably haven't got the high trust stuff that we were talking about. And then, I don't know, one strategy is to have a small contract and try it out and see what you get. But you can have, sometimes I develop what's called an umbrella strategy, which, lays out the sort of general approach and how we'll work and the values that will play out and how time will be used, and that can help a bit. But yeah, at a certain degree, if you don't have the trust, so you're going to have to let it happen, because it's like a service. It's like R&D. It's a service almost. I'm beginning to think of it like that. So give it a shot. How do you go about employing any service? If you've got an IT provider, instead of giving them a 2-year contract and locking yourself in, you might want to try them out first and see what it feels like. So I think that's why the shorter contracts can be good if you're not convinced.
There is plenty of skepticism out there, especially from those that when they think about evaluation, they think about something quite rigid that's got kind of, particular designs attached to them with big long reports, big fat reports that give them reassurance that they've got high quality evidence, on the table. And if that's what they're after, if that's their only vision of evaluation, then it can be quite hard to convince a client that this is rigorous. But I guess the rigor that and so you need to make a case for the rigor being in the reasoning processes that we use and the sense-making processes that we use as things are being developed, because we're bringing data to the table. And I guess, as Jess said, if they're really questioning it, then maybe it's not the right place to do DE, that readiness piece, if they're really not convinced. And maybe you just do a small thing somewhere and but in my experience, demand is outstripping the supply quite at the moment. So if you're in the convince me game, then I would say just leave it, because there's plenty of other places that stuff's going on.
And you might find it
I agree, Kate.
Find a developmental evaluator at the moment, because we're in hot demand. Jamie?
Well, I think that engagement, I think that's an indicator, because I think there is some abstractness in the early goings on that you've got to kind of live with. But if the funder or the decision maker is not available for the meeting and wants to sort of stuff down the line, I want to see the plan. I just don't think it's a good DE situation. I think you actually would waste a lot of money pursuing some questions that may or may not actually be the question. So I think if there's engagement, you can talk about well, what is really being innovated here? Where is the complexity in the system? What is it that we need to know to inform next steps, to shape this strategy? And what is keeping you up at night? And then let's build in some rigor in a process to try and answer that as best as we can with the time horizon we're working with. And there'll be limitations. There's limitations always in evaluation, and time horizon will always be one of them. We can't magically make that disappear. But I think you can get at some proxies, you can get at some evidence often in many cases that will help you make at least a more informed decision. You may not make all the ambiguity go away, but it's definitely rigorous if you do the homework.
Really does to me, hearing you say those questions, Jamie, it really does sound like it's a coaching role. And we've said it before, but that drives it home. You're there as a coach, it sounds like. Or part of
Really,
it.
I would say rarely now do I do like a DE workshop, away you go. Like so much now for me is work with an organization, provide certainly some workshops and training, but then provide some coaching and provide some direct DE. That kind of triangle, I think it's become the optimal model to really help people answer questions, but also sort of build the practice over time within their teams.
Fantastic. Another question here from Kate. Do you ever have to compromise on the types of things you can measure or track with DE? She says an example through engaging proxy indicators. This is especially when you might be applying it to a context where outcomes take a long time to be realized.
Well, I mean, often you need feedback quickly. So that's the first thing that you're managing, is that you can't wait for 6 months or a year to get the results out. People want the feedback in the next few weeks or the next month, really. So the short timelines are much shorter. We talk about these short loops. You can have some things that are long term in there as well, but a lot of our effort is on short loops. So I guess you do have to modify. You have to be very pragmatic, and the things that you just can't do in a DE that you could do in another evaluation. But there are still ways of bringing rigor in. I have come to think, hey, you can always triangulate. You can always triangulate your evidence, even if you're in a rush. You can triangulate. If you've only got 2 weeks, you can at least ask different people, look at what's happening, dig around. So I try and add rigor on the run with DE. So don't give up on rigor, but yes, there are a lot of changes. And like, if you like, I wouldn't call it compromises, but it's just a different reality when you're doing short loops. What do you reckon, Jamie and Kate?
I agree. I think that kind of compromises every evaluation, not just DE, right? You're always making trade-offs on like how hard or easy is it to get data? How important is it? You know, where do we put our resources? You can't answer everything. And so there's always a priority setting. And I think there is, you know, I was involved with the Canadian initiative around food and healthcare. And in part it was a nutrition kind of and sort of health outcomes initiative, but largely it was actually a climate initiative, trying to actually shift food procurement practices towards more sustainable choices. And so it was really described as a systems change initiative. So there were all these innovations happening in hospitals and long-term care homes, but the larger systems changes were way far out, like changes in resource flows, changes in organizational culture, changes in, you know, policy. And so what we got to is, well, what is halfway to systems change? What would kind of the, you know, what Kate is saying here, like proxy, like what would be promising to see that would tell us we might be actually on a pathway to longer term systems change? Or what would be signals we might see that would tell us we should have some caution here, we need to actually rethink what's going to work and not work? And I think that was a really useful kind of framing around very ambitious, very long-term kind of aspirations, but actually bringing it into the time horizon of the initiative that we're working on.
Yeah, I guess what I would add there is that some of our rigor, yes, we do have to compromise when we're on really short cycles in terms of the kind of the compromises we might make to some of the time we might spend actually in refining and testing measures and all of those kinds of things that you might do when you have more time to do stuff. But I guess that's why it always pays to have, you know, that part of the rigor comes from having the expertise in the room, or those of us who have got experience using different kinds of tools and know how to adapt and shift and pull something out of our little kitty or our kit of tools and resources. But also, as Jamie said, it's the same problem that besets all evaluation, all evidence, is that it's never perfect. One line of evidence is never perfect. And Jess talks about triangulation. So you need more than one source of evidence on the table. But one of the ways in which we increase the rigor, and I think we don't think about it as rigor often, but that is to have the perspectives we need around the room, making sense of the data that we've got. So if we really need to understand what's going on, instead of it just being the DE evaluator, you've got to have the right people around the table. So if you're working on an initiative in healthcare, or in, as you know, I can be in family harm, or in some of the places where we're working, have you got people at the table who understand that context, who are part of that, making sense of the data with you, because they will see things in that data that you don't see. They will raise issues that about what's not there, about what's surprising them, and that's where the rigor comes. When we haven't got as much rigor in our data collection, or as you might like, or we have shorter cycles, if we get the right people around the room and around the table, we can increase the rigor of our reasoning. And I think that's one of the ways, one of the key parts of this practice that is different.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kate. And thank you to all our panelists for joining me here today. We've got to wrap it up. We're right on the 10 o'clock mark, or in our time zone anyway. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you both working on the course with us to get it to this point, and also joining us for this webinar today. And thank you to all of our participants as well. And really just want to let you know that the course will be launching at the end of this month. There still are seats available if you want to join us for the inaugural journey of DE, the course. And yeah, there'll be an email coming out about that tomorrow with a special discount as well. So yeah, hope to see you in the course. Thanks for joining us.